Hi, I'm Marlon Pedrosa with eXp Realty up here in Las Vegas, Nevada. And we want to thank you for choosing us for your real estate needs. We prepared this video for our clients so they better understand the documents we use. And while we don't review every section of the document, we do try and clear up some of the most relevant concerns. We're recording this video in May of 2022, and if you're watching long after that date, there are likely changes that have taken place in this document, and this video may have some parts that are outdated. Also know that we operate in Southern Nevada and is more specific to our market. While you may be able to glean some value from this video, please know that no two markets operate exactly alike. And finally, I need you to know that I'm not an attorney, and none of what I'm saying should be interpreted as legal advice. This is the residential purchase agreement. So this is a document prepared by the Las Vegas Realtors, our local board here, to help buyers present all their terms to sellers when writing an offer on a residential property here. So let's just get right into it, and I'm going to talk about this document. So page one, first, it's 11 pages, so let's get started. Page one, first we just talk about who the buyers are. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer are identified here, and the property they're going to be purchasing, the address is going to be here in the following lines, and the property's tax ID numbers are right here. Then of course we have the offer price. In this case it is $500,000. Then this line just below identifying the buyer of the property, you declare whether or not you're going to be a resident in that property. Now, if you're going to be the owner occupying, and if not, it's going to be an investment property. So this is an important designation in that a lot of the financing that we provide for buyers these days is specific to owner occupant or not. So make sure you declare properly whether you're going to be residing in the property or intend to use it as an investment property. Moving on from there, now at the bottom of page one, we have all the numbers involved in the offer. First is the earnest money deposit. In this case, it's $5,000, and it's being wired in 2 business days to the escrow holder. The earnest money will then be deposited into escrow, and we will come across that just in a few moments. So additional deposit, this is rare, but every now and then buyers and sellers agree that the buyer should put more money into escrow, and that's where we would use that, but again, it's very rare. This is the amount that the buyer is going to borrow from a lender. So in this case, we are doing a conventional loan, and they are going to be borrowing $470,000. Beyond that, we have here, if the loan was going to be assumed, it was an existing loan, we would use that here, and that's pretty rare. But if the interest rates start to go up, we may see more of this. After that, we have if an owner was going to carry papers for a buyer, or if the seller was going to carry paper for a buyer, we would put that here, and we would of course have to add some significant paperwork to accommodate that. Financing addendum would have to be attached as well. Now here is the balance of the purchase price, or the balance of the down payment. If you take this figure, $25,000, and add it to the earnest money, $5,000, you get $30,000, which would comprise the down payment for this buyer. And all these numbers on this page would add up to the total at the bottom of $500,000. Now that's page one, and at the bottom of each of these pages, you're going to see the names of the buyer or buyers, and you're going to see the address of the property that they are purchasing. Then at the bottom of this page, you'll also see a set of initials for buyers and for sellers. Now on to page two. On page two, we have that the new loan application in this case is going to be completed within 2 business days of acceptance. This means the buyer is going to get the documents to the lender. Hopefully the buyer has already worked on getting these documents or are getting their loan approved, and then this would be the last piece of that puzzle. Again, I'm hoping that the buyer would have done a lot of work in advance of writing this offer, and we would want to submit a loan approval letter with the offer when we send it over to the seller. Next, we have some important contingencies. First is the appraisal contingency, and in this case, we've asked for 20 days to complete that, which means that we not only have to have the appraisal done, but if it did not come in at value, we need the buyer and the seller to agree on how to handle that. Is the buyer going to come in with additional cash, or is the seller going to reduce their price, or are you going to meet somewhere in the middle? So how is that going to be resolved? Whatever resolution they come up with must be done and agreed upon within 20 days. And this line is very important. As you can see this several times on all conditions. If the residential purchase agreement is not canceled in writing on or before the appraisal deadline, in this case, the buyer shall have deemed waive the appraisal contingency. And this means that if you don't get your appraisal done within 20 days, and if it comes in low, and you have to negotiate with the seller within that 20 days as well. If not, the buyer would likely have to ask for an extension. And in that case, I ask for more time to get that done, and hopefully the seller would agree to it. If not, the buyer may have to cancel the agreement or put their earnest money at risk. So next would be the loan contingency. In this case, we've asked for 24 days, and these are calendar days to approve the loan. And in this timeline, the lender needs to complete all of the processes necessary to approve a loan. Yet it has that same statement below it, so it's not done in that timeline. The buyer will deem to have waived that contingency. Now, if this was a cash purchase, normally we would submit on what we call proof of funds with the offer to show the seller that the buyer is able to pay cash for the property. And so if we want to cash purchase, we might put 0 or 1 business day there, but just tell how many days the buyer will provide that to the seller. So if this property was contingent upon the buyer selling their existing home in order to be able to buy this home, we would mark this one here. Okay, so we would check this box, and then we would have to attach what's called a contingent upon sale addendum. Now, this is a document that identifies all of the terms of the existing escrow, and hopefully it's an existing escrow. All right, so that the buyer needs to complete before they can complete this purchase. So if the buyer is selling their own home before they buy this, when it needs the funds from that to do this. So the further along you are, the better off you're going to be, and the seller will be a little less wary and probably more certain that you're going to be able to close the deal. Fixtures and personal property, and especially a very important part of this document, just identifies all of the things that are going to stay with the home and all of the items that stay. So all of the ceiling fans, you'll see plumbing, heating fixtures, the appliances, the only appliances that don't normally automatically stay, it would be the refrigerator, washer, and dryer. And those 3, in this case, the buyers ask those to stay as well. I want to point out an important part of this section that could get overlooked. Solar power systems. If you have a solar power system and you're a seller and you don't own it outright and you're leasing it, you're going to need to counter this offer, because this offer says that solar power systems can be provided free of liens, that it will be transferred to the buyer. So know that if you do have a lease for that or any other equipment that's included in here, you need to count that out and identify that to the buyer. You can say, hey, listen, I need you to assume this lease going forward, and this is an important part of this document. opening of escrow. So in this case, we are using First American Title with the Maria Rampa. We're simply identifying where we're going to be doing it. So close of escrow and earnest money. Of course, we talked about that before. That is the money used to open escrow. Close of escrow in this case is about 45 days, but note that it says on or before. If the buyer and seller both agree that they want to close early, they can, but both must agree. One side can't just unilaterally say, hey, I want to close early, and the other side doesn't agree. So, that's going to be a problem, but they can't do that. But both must close by the 20th or ask for a subsequent extension if they can close by that date. So the IRS will be informed. The seller needs to know that they'll probably be getting a 1099 for this. Title insurance will be provided by the seller to the buyer, and in this case, since we're doing a loan, the buyer is going to have to purchase that. That's called a lender's policy in addition to their owner's policy as well. So buyer's due diligence. In this case, we're talking about 12 days. So the buyers ask for 12 days with which to complete their inspections. The seller needs to ensure that all the necessary utilities are on, and I would say that they need to stay on throughout the close of escrow. Then the seller can then transfer them after close of escrow or at close of escrow for that matter. So the property inspection is to be done during the due diligence period. So the buyer has a right to cancel or resolve these objections within that due diligence time frame, but only within that time frame. So it's important to note, like this line here, again, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the due diligence condition. And when will they do that? So if they fail to cancel the agreement or to resolve with a seller any objections, they have to do the inspection. That now needs to be done, in this case, within the 12 days. So 12 days is not just to do the inspection, but it is to resolve any issues as a result of the inspection. And next, we have all the variety of inspections that the buyer could choose from. In this case, we simply choose a home inspection, and then we chose to have a termite inspection too. So the home inspection is a considerably basic but a generic all-encompassing inspection for the property. In the course of doing the inspection, the home inspector discovers issues beyond that they think are important. They might suggest to the buyer that they go ahead and follow up with a roof inspection, although it's initially waived here. So the buyer could add it within that time frame, within their due diligence time, and they could choose to add it and say, hey, what, I want to do a roof inspection now too. So if the seller doesn't agree to add that, then the buyer could essentially cancel. So normally, that's not a problem though. Certifications. Sometimes a buyer might ask for the seller to provide certification even though it's not a warranty. So I guess that's certainty that the job was done properly. Buyers request for repairs. We just talk about that, so this is just more identifying that the brokers aren't responsible and it's the buyer's responsibility to do it. And the buyer needs to be satisfied. That's an important element of this. The fees and prorations. Now, here's what we normally divide fees. Now, I'm going to say normally because all of this are negotiable. Normally, we would say the escrow fees would be shared between the buyer and seller 50-50, and that the seller would pay the transfer tax, that the buyer would pay both the lender's title policy and the appraisal, and the seller would pay, in fact, the owner's title policy. So everything else is to be prorated. Taxes, HOA fees, trash services, all that stuff is to be prorated as of the date of closing. So at the date of closing, the seller is reimbursed or whatever they paid beyond that, and then the buyer takes it over, and that again applies to all those other fees related to the transaction. Preliminary title report. The buyer is entitled to see that within 10 business days of opening escrow. The title company should provide that to them, and they always does anyway. Closing fees, at the top of page 5, for example, in this case, the buyer is not asking the seller to contribute to buyer's lender fees, but a buyer can choose to ask the seller to pay $2,500 towards their closing costs, and that's including any mandatory fees that a lender may ask to provide, which are pretty rare, but they do happen. So in this case, the buyer says, look, Mr. Seller, so I'm a little short on cash. I need you to help me with my closing cost. So understand as a buyer that you are in fact reducing the seller's proceeds when you do this. And this is not money that comes out of thin air, right? So, and it's very important that you know that the seller is going to evaluate your offer based on this and decide whether or not it's financially still going to make them hope or it's going to make them happy. In certain markets, these are very prevalent and available, and sellers are happy to do it. In other markets, if it's leaning more to the sellers, market like the market right now, they might be reluctant to provide the buyer with any closing costs, and they may look for another buyer who doesn't need them. So just keep that in mind that you ask for these types of costs. So home protection plan, in this case, we're asking for a 1-year warranty from First American Warranty for up to $500. We're asking the seller to pay for that in this case. Transfer of title it will be at close of escrow, and close of escrow is defined here in Nevada for us as when the deed is recorded at the county, specifically the Clark County. So common interest communities, this is the HOA. So when we buy homes within an HOA, in this case, this seller needs to provide the buyer with the documents necessary to do so, and we call that a resale package. That resale package needs to be provided to the buyer within 15 days of acceptance, and then the buyer has 5 days with which to review it. If the buyer elects to cancel that agreement, we have to deliver this seller within those 5 days. It's very, very important. So let's say if the buyer does cancel based on that, they would get their earnest money back. And now down here, there are related expenses of transferring a home from one owner to another with an HOA. In this case, we're asking the seller to pay all those fees. It is negotiable though. It could go either way. Sometimes buyer will pay the capital contribution fee, but these days it seems like where most buyers are asking sellers to pay all those fees. We're also asking the seller to provide a disclosure. In this case, the seller's real property disclosure form. If that one form that was checked off that there was some construction defect claims, then we would want additional disclosure as well. Okay, moving on to page 6, of course, we're not allowed to discriminate federal fair housing. So that's what federal fair housing means. We're not allowed to discriminate. And there's a walkthrough to be completed within, in this case, we're saying within 3 days of closing. At the walkthrough, the buyer is going to make sure that the home is in basically the same condition as when they first saw it, and then any repairs they requested were done to their satisfaction. It's not the time to do a home inspection. It's not the time to add things necessarily. You're just making sure things are pretty much the same, or again, the repairs were done properly. Deliver your possession. So that's at close of escrow. We said before, just a moment ago, close of escrow here in Nevada is defined as when the properties are recorded. That doesn't mean when you sign papers. It could be that day, it could be the next day, it could be even a couple days later. Several things have to happen for that to go through. So the lender has to fund the buyer. You have to bring your money to escrow as well, and usually that's in the form of a wire. because we're a good fund state. And then all of that, once that's all collected and everybody signed off, then the escrow company needs to run it down to Clark County and have it recorded. Risk of loss. This basically says that if the property is damaged before closing, it's the seller's responsibility to bring it back up, and the buyer could cancel. If it's damaged after closing, it becomes a buyer's problem. This purchase agreement cannot be assigned unless both parties agree. So if the buyer wants to change who the buyer is, or add somebody or delete somebody, they have to get the approval of the seller. Upon cancellation of the agreement, as long as it's done within accordance and within the timelines, and the earnest money should be refunded to the buyer. If not, then the seller could be or make a claim to it if the buyer is in some default, and that's what it says here. So if there is some default and there's not an agreement, both parties would agree to a mediation here before a lawsuit has happened, but neither party is relinquishing the right side to sue. So if the seller were to default, the buyer could sue them for specific performance. If the buyer were to default, the seller is entitled to keep the earnest money deposit, or the EMD, as their mitigated damages. I would say that it's important for buyers to understand that the earnest money is significant to the seller only in the sense that, first of all, the seller doesn't want your earnest money. They want to close a deal, but if you don't close the deal, the seller has been damaged. They took the property off the market for a period of time when another buyer could have seen it and made an offer. So that's the damage. And plus, there's carrying costs, obviously, for a seller during that time frame. So escrow is a neutral third party. Basically, they are the bank. They collect all the monies and the documents, and then they distribute all the monies and the documents appropriately at the end. If there were unclaimed funds at the end of the process and it was canceled and there's earnest money there, so they're going to ask both of the parties to resolve that earnest money just quickly, or they've reserved the right to start charging people to maintain that escrow as an open status. Broker's compensation fees, it's $395 basically from eXp Realty for standard fees to execute transactions or provides specialized services. Brokers charge brokerage fees for services such as purchases, sales, consultations, negotiations, and delivery. So waiver of claims basically says that the property being sold where is as is, and that's what the buyers understands. So there's no implied warranties here now. So we have definitions and abbreviations, and there's lots of acronyms in real estate. I probably used a few in describing this. So if you need their definition, they're here on page 8 of the document. And signatures and deliveries, this basically says it's okay to use electronic signatures. Once documents are delivered to the other party, they're considered received. 1031 property exchange, this is only for investors. If you want more information on 1031 and property, you need to call, and we'll be able to walk you through that. So the HUD VA FHA escape clause. So this is a disclosure that gives FHA VA HUD homeowners extra protection to cancel a transaction and receive a refund of any upfront earnest money if the value of the home is below the agreed upon a sales price. Give me a call if you have any more questions about that. It's kind of like a little bit more complicated. Other essential terms, this basically says time is of the essence and no changes should be made to this agreement without being in writing. So anything that's said verbally does not count. Well, first things we learned in real estate, until it's written, it doesn't count. And it says that it is a legally binding contract. This capital letters, bold letters mean It's important that you understand it. If you don't, we would encourage you to get the advice of legal counsel or an accountant or somebody you want to. By all means, do that, but this is a document used for virtually every transaction here, and so here in Nevada. There are no agenda items attached to this, so there is no additional terms made here without. The bottom, we're identifying myself in this case as the buyer's agent, and I am saying here that I am not an interested party. I am not a partner in this deal. I'm not related to the buyer in any way. We are given the seller a deadline of 5 o'clock, just a couple days from now, if they get back to us. If they don't get back to us as the buyer, we can move on. So if they don't get back to us within this time frame, basically we can assume that there's no deal. Now if they do take a little extra time, we can extend that. Both parties could extend it. Okay, so I would think you would want to do that in writing with them with an addendum. And now we get to the seller's response page, which is on page 11. And here we're identifying the seller's agent. So if I both represent both the seller and the buyer, or I'm representing both parties, so we would have what we call a consent to act involved in this as well. And that's another form. So down here it says, well, now I am a part to the transaction. So do I have an interest in my partner, and or do I have some relation to the seller? Okay. Next one is this is FIRPTA. This is if the seller is a foreign national. It is very important that this one to be disclosed. If not, there could be a tax consequences to the buyer. So very important we understand that. Down here, the sellers telling us whether they accept or whether they counter or whether they reject the offer. If they countered it, they'll send back a counter offer, and they're saying they agree to all the terms with this agreement except for those items that they've changed in the counter offer. Now this is where the seller would sign and date, and that is our residential purchase agreement. I hope this was informative for you. I hope this was informative for you. I hope you found this video helpful. Feel free to review our other videos at www.marlonepedrosa.com. Once again, thanks for choosing Marlone Pedrosa with eXp Realty for your real estate needs. And if you ever have any questions, just call or text 702-354-3262.